There is a thought worth carrying with you into tonight's rest, and it is this: that the worst disasters in history rarely arrive without warning. They accumulate. They are assembled piece by slow piece across generations, long before any single man or woman steps onto the stage to deliver the final act. And so tonight we begin not with fire and not with madness, and not even with a king. We begin with a family. We begin with a bloodline. We begin several centuries before the man who would finally bring that bloodline's darkest potential to its full and terrible flower. Let your breathing slow now. Let whatever the day required of you settle and release. There is nothing ahead of you tonight but long, unhurried time and the quiet movement of history through its own dark corridors. The stories you are about to enter are old stories. They have already happened. They carry no urgency. They only carry weight, and weight, when you let it, becomes something very close to rest. The Targaryens came from the east. This is the most elemental fact about them, and it is worth letting it sit in the mind the way a stone sits in still water, not moving, not requiring anything, simply present. They came from Valyria, the great empire of dragon lords, a civilization so vast and so ancient that even the maesters who have spent their lives trying to understand it confess that most of it is simply gone, consumed along with its holders in the event they call the Doom. The Targaryens were one of 40 Dragonlord families, not the greatest, not the most powerful, not the ones whose names filled the mouths of bards or whose stone likenesses stood in the grandest forums of the freehold. They were, by most accounts, a middling family of reasonable wealth and considerable ambition, distinguished from their peers primarily by the peculiar seriousness with which they took the art of prophetic dreaming. It was a dream, they say, that saved them. 12 years before the Doom, a young Targaryen named Daenys had a vision of fire consuming the world she knew, and her father, a man named Enar, believed her completely. He gathered the family, gathered the 5 dragons they possessed at the time, gathered what could be moved and what could be carried, and sailed west to the island of Dragonstone at the edge of the narrow sea. Every other Dragonlord family perished. Every dragon remaining in Valyria died with the empire it had helped build. The Targaryens watched from their cold rock in the western sea as the horizon lit with a catastrophe they had been warned about in a dream, and they survived, and they were for a long time afterward a small and somewhat diminished family in possession of a great cold castle and the last living dragons in the world. What Valyria had been is now mostly speculation and ghostlight. The maesters know that it burned hot, and built high and commanded dragons and held slaves and worked a magic whose mechanisms have never been fully understood. They know that the Valyrian freehold was a republic of sorts, governed by a council of dragonlords, that it expanded across the known world through a combination of military conquest and the specific terror of dragonfire, and that it lasted in some form for approximately 5,000 years before the Doom unmade it in a single generation. What they do not fully know is what kind of people the Valyrians actually were, in the private interiors of their lives, in their relationships with one another, in the texture of their emotional experience. That knowledge burned with them. But the Targaryens carried fragments. They carried their language, which they maintained in private even after adopting the common tongue. They carried their custom of marrying within the family, brother to sister, uncle to niece, a practice that troubled the faith of the Seven deeply, and would eventually produce one of the defining conflicts of the dynasty. They carried their physical distinctiveness, the silver-gold hair, the violet and lilac eyes, the particular pallor that made them look to their subjects like beings from another world entirely. And they carried, some maesters believe, a subtle vulnerability in the arrangement of their blood, something in the Valyrian lineage that, when concentrated through generations of cousin marriage and sibling marriage, expressed itself in ways that defied easy categorization. It is worth pausing on that thought for a moment rather than hurrying past it. The maesters do not agree on this point. Some dismiss it entirely as superstition built from a small sample of unfortunate kings. Others point to the records with quiet insistence. Of the 17 Targaryen kings who sat the Iron Throne before the dynasty's end, a number that can charitably be described as significant showed patterns of behaviour that the healers of the Citadel described variously as melancholia, fever of the mind, unnatural passions or visions. Baelor the Blessed starved himself in prayer and locked his sisters in a tower to protect their virtue from his own desire. Maker's son Aerion Brightflame drank Wildfire, believing it would transform him into a dragon, and died of it. Maegor the Cruel was a matter of simple and practical brutality, but there were signs, even in him, of something that could not be governed by ordinary will. The common people developed a saying for it. When a Targaryen is born, they said, the gods flip a coin. The image is simple and memorable and probably too tidy to capture the full complexity of what the records show, but it contains a real observation. The same family produced Jaehaerys the Conciliator, perhaps the greatest king Westeros ever knew, and Maegor the Cruel, who committed atrocities that still stain the dynasty's memory 3 generations later. It produced Daeron the Young Dragon, the brilliant military genius who conquered Dorne at 17, and Daeron the Drunkard, who presided over a court of such spectacular dissolution that the small folk nicknamed his reign the Fiddler's Field Days. Greatness and catastrophe, generation after generation emerging from the same bloodline, the same pale eyes, the same ancestral rock on the Blackwater Bay. Aerys Targaryen II was born into this inheritance. He arrived in the world in the 143rd year after Aegon's conquest, the son of King Jaehaerys II and Queen Shaera. He was the great-great-great-great-grandson of the first Aegon, who had ridden Balerion the Black Dread across a continent and forged 300 warring kingdoms into one realm by fire and negotiation. He was, by any genealogical accounting, the product of everything the Targaryens had become after 3 centuries of ruling from the Iron Throne. Their ambitions, their elegance, their strangeness, their accumulated marriages within the family that kept the blood concentrated and the hair silver and the temperament volatilely, sometimes magnificently, sometimes catastrophically, their own. There is something almost tender about him in these early years, before everything that came after. He was said to be handsome in youth, possessed of the characteristic Targaryen looks in their most favourable expression, the silver hair, the violet eyes, the lean angular frame. He was quick-minded, charming when he chose to be, capable of the kind of sparkling conversation that made courts feel alive. He was also, according to those who knew him young, somewhat vain, somewhat impatient with disagreement, and prone to grandiose visions of himself that did not always survive contact with the actual work of ruling. These are not unusual traits in a prince who has been told all his life that he is exceptional. They are not in themselves the seeds of disaster. They only become that in combination with everything else, with the bloodline's whisper, with the specific pressures his reign would place on the structure of his mind, with the long darkness that waited for him in a cell in a city called Duskendale. But we are not there yet. Rest now for a moment, in the time before. The coin is still in the air, the kingdom is still whole. The boy who will become the Mad King is still, for a brief period, simply a prince. Perhaps a difficult one, perhaps one already showing the faint fault lines that pressure would eventually crack wide open, but not yet broken, not yet burning. Let your breathing slow again. Let the air move through you easily. There is a long history between here and the catastrophe, and we will walk through it together at whatever pace the night requires. The fire is still far off, the city is still standing, and somewhere in the Red Keep, a young man is being made, slowly and inexorably, into the thing that will undo him. The question of what Valyria was, at its core, is one that the historians of Westeros approach with a mixture of genuine scholarly humility and a frustration that they do not always articulate clearly. The Citadel's archives contain fragments, records from traders who dealt with the freehold before the Doom, accounts from Volantine scholars who had connections to the western edge of Valyrian civilization, the occasional recovered text in High Valyrian that the maesters have managed to partially translate. But these fragments are precisely that, edges of a picture whose centre is simply gone. What they suggest, assembled with the care of people who know they are working with incomplete material, is a civilization of extraordinary sophistication, one that had solved problems in architecture, in agriculture, in the management of large populations, in metallurgy, in the specific application of magical energy to practical construction, that the rest of the world is still working toward understanding in the centuries after its destruction. The Valyrian roads are perhaps the most immediate evidence of this. They still exist across Essos, in a state of preservation that the stoneworkers of the present age find humbling and somewhat inexplicable. They do not crack in the frost. They do not buckle under the weight of generations of use. The technique by which they were laid is not known, The assumption is that it involved fire and magic in some combination, the same combination that appears to have underlain most of what Valyria built that lasted. But the result is a surface so smooth and so durable that traders and armies still prefer them to roads built by any other civilization. The roads outlasted the people who made them by 5,000 years and show no meaningful signs of deteriorating. They are, in a way, the most honest monument the freehold left behind. Useful, impersonal, indifferent to what happened to the hands that built them. The Targaryens carried away from this civilization not the roads and not the towers, and not the vast slave cities of the eastern coast, but the more portable inheritance, language, custom, a particular relationship to fire, and to the creatures that embodied fire's most dramatic expression. The 5 dragons they brought to Dragonstone were among the last survivors of a much larger population that had lived in and around Valyria during the freehold's height, creatures that the dragon lords bred and bonded with through processes that combined genuine understanding of draconic biology with rituals that even the Targaryens, in their later years, could not fully reconstruct when they needed to. The loss of the dragons, when it came for the Targaryens, was therefore not simply a military loss, it was an identity loss, which is a different and in some ways more grievous thing. The dragons had been, for the family's entire history on Dragonstone, and in the centuries after the conquest, the visible proof of the Valyrian heritage, the thing that distinguished Targaryen rule from the rule of any other house, the thing that made the abstract claim of conquest into something that anyone with eyes could understand. A man with a dragon is not simply a man with a weapon. He is a man with an argument that ends all other arguments. When the last dragon died, the Targaryens became, in the eyes of those who had always viewed them with a mixture of awe and resentment, simply another ruling family, strange-looking, custom-bound, and possessed of claims that were historical rather than immediate. Aerys was born into this diminished inheritance and felt its weight in ways that he probably could not have fully articulated. The silver hair and the violet eyes set him apart. The customs of his family surrounded him with their specific strangeness. The stories of Balerion and Meraxes and Varga and the other great dragons of the conquest era were presumably part of his education as they were part of every Targaryen prince's education. But the dragons were gone, had been gone since his grandfather's grandfather's time, and the living connection to the Valyrian heritage that they represented was now purely theoretical, a matter of genealogy and story rather than scales and fire, and the particular kind of sovereignty that comes from sitting on the back of something enormous and alive and dangerous. This is one of the threads that runs very quietly beneath the entire history of Aerys' reign and the obsession that eventually consumed it. He could not have dragons, but he could have fire, and fire in the Targaryen imagination, in the specific mythology of a family that traced itself back to dragon lords and forward to the prophecy of ice and fire that the dynasty's wisest members had always believed was their particular purpose in the world, was not simply combustion, it was connection. It was the inheritance made present and tangible and real, in a way that the silver hair and the old words and the careful genealogy could not quite achieve on their own. To love fire, for a Targaryen, was to be in some sense near the thing that had always defined them, to feel the warmth of the origin through the medium of the flame. The particular horror of Aerys is partly this, that the impulse itself was not wholly alien to his heritage, not a complete departure from the Targaryen pattern. He was reaching for something real. He was reaching for it through means that became, as the years in Duskendale and the years after remade his interior landscape, increasingly disconnected from anything that could be called wisdom, or governance, or care for the people and the realm he held in his hands. But the reaching was not invented from nothing. It was the dynasty's oldest instinct, the bone-deep Valyrian conviction that fire was power, and that power was their birthright, expressed through a mind that had lost the capacity to express it in any way that did not move toward catastrophe. Sleep, when it comes, tends to arrive sideways, not as a single arrival, but as a series of small permissions, each one releasing a little more of the grip the waking world keeps on the mind. This is something worth knowing tonight, as the history ahead of us reaches further back into an era that most people never think to consider. The years when Aerys Targaryen was simply a young man trying to be a good king, and the possibility of that still felt real. Let whatever thoughts remain from the day settle and grow distant. They are not needed here. What is needed here is only your quiet presence, and the slow accumulation of a history that helps explain, without quite excusing, how an age of fire and blood began. The court of King's Landing in the years just before Aerys ascended to the Iron Throne was, by most accounts, a place of considerable sophistication and a certain anxious elegance. His father, Jaehaerys II, was not a beloved king in the way that the old Jaehaerys, the conciliator, had been beloved, but he was a capable one, a man who understood administration and diplomacy, and the management of lords whose interests did not naturally align. He had navigated the realm through the Blackfire Rebellion's final expression, the War of the Ninepenny Kings, with a competence that earned him respect if not affection. His court reflected him, organised, somewhat dry, efficient. It was the court of a man who knew how kingdoms worked and applied that knowledge methodically. Into this environment, Aerys arrived as crown prince with something his father perhaps lacked. Warmth, at least in performance. He was 25 when his father died, young by the standards of the dynasty's long reigns, and the court that watched him ascend saw what they hoped was the best version of the Targaryen coin. He was vibrant where Jaehaerys had been measured. He was quick to laugh, quick to reward those who pleased him, quick to speak of grand ambitions for the realm, new roads, new ports, new alliances with the free cities, a Westeros that would not merely endure but expand. The small council listened to these plans with the patient attention of men who had heard ambitious young kings before, and knew that the ambitions tended to reshape themselves on contact with the actual immovability of the world. But something in these early years was genuine. The relationship that defined the first decade of Aerys' reign was not his marriage to his sister Rhaella, a union that was arranged rather than chosen, and that produced more unhappiness than it ever produced comfort, but his friendship with his childhood companion, the man who would become his hand, Tywin Lannister. It is one of the more remarkable partnerships in the history of the Seven Kingdoms, and one of the more consequential, and to understand either man it is necessary to spend some time inside it, to feel its texture before it curdled. Tywin Lannister was 3 years younger than Aerys, and had been his companion since both were boys. The two men were, in almost every practical way, complementary. Where Aerys was erratic, Tywin was methodical. Where Aerys dreamed in visions and images, Tywin thought in consequences and logistics. Where Aerys craved admiration and found sustained concentration difficult, Tywin had almost no interest in admiration, but could hold a single problem in his attention for years without loosening his grip on it. They were, in the language the common people might use, a head and a hand that belonged to different bodies, but somehow functioned together. The realm, under their combined stewardship, ran well. It ran as it had perhaps not run since the early years of the old Jaehaerys, with clean accounting and settled borders, and a small folk who had reason to feel that the kingdom was being administered rather than simply ruled. What Aerys gave Tywin was authority, the hand's authority, which in practice meant nearly everything, since Aerys was content in these years to let Tywin manage what he found tedious. What Tywin gave Aerys was the machinery of good government, the actual grinding daily work of keeping a realm stable, so that Aerys could play at being a great king without needing to fully become one. It was, in retrospect, an arrangement that suited Aerys' temperament well. He received the praise and the theatre of kingship, while Tywin absorbed the labour and the frustration of its practice. For a time, this worked. For a time, the court functioned almost as a model of what a well-ordered monarchy could be. It is worth sitting with that image for a moment, the realm running smoothly, the young king still charming enough to hold the loyalty of his lords, the hand competent enough to handle what his king could not. It is worth sitting with it because what follows is so complete a destruction of everything that image represented. History likes to offer these small periods of stability before its most significant collapses, as if to establish what was lost before it begins the long business of losing it. The reign of Aerys and Tywin in its first decade is one of those periods. Not perfect. There were already signs, already the impatience and the vanity and the particular cruelty that could emerge when Aerys felt challenged, but functional, and occasionally even something approaching flourishing. The marriage to Rhaella was not among the things that flourished. She was his sister, as was traditional, and she was by accounts a quiet and melancholic woman who had very little say in the arrangement of her own life. The marriage produced a number of pregnancies in its early years, most of which ended in loss, stillbirths and miscarriages, and sons who survived their births by only days or weeks. The grief of this was real, and it had effects on both of them, though those effects moved in different directions. For Rhaella, the losses seemed to deepen an already sorrow-weighted temperament. For Aerys, they introduced a paranoid thread into his thinking, a conviction that the losses were not natural, that enemies were at work, that something was being done to him and to his line in the dark. It is the first clearly identifiable appearance of the pattern that would eventually consume him, the movement from pain to suspicion, from suspicion to accusation, from accusation to punishment. But these were still early days. The realm did not yet know what it had. The lords of the Seven Kingdoms still sent their sons to squire in the Red Keep, still rode to the tourneys that Aerys sponsored with genuine enthusiasm, still offered their daughters for consideration as companions to the Queen, still attended the great feasts and received the king's easy laughter as proof of his continued goodwill toward them. The appearance of normality is a remarkable thing. It can be maintained long after the interior has already begun to hollow out, and so you might let this second image settle alongside the first, the young king and his hand, walking in the gardens of the Red Keep in the long, golden light of an afternoon that seems to have no end. Tywin, speaking carefully, precisely, in the measured sentences of a man who wastes nothing. Aerys listening with half his attention, already half elsewhere, already composing in his mind the next grand project, the next transformation, the thing that will make his reign remembered. The dragons are long dead. The Iron Throne waits in the Great Hall, its edges as sharp as the day Aegon the Conqueror built it from the swords of his enemies. The city below them smells of the sea and of wood smoke, and of the particular crowded humanity of a great capital at ease with itself. It is a good afternoon. There will be fewer of them than anyone present knows. The early years of the reign produced one image that the histories tend to preserve with particular care, and it is worth dwelling on it for the texture it carries. Aerys and Tywin at the great tourney at Lannisport, organised to celebrate the birth of the first surviving Lannister heir. It was a grand occasion by the standards of the era. Knights from across the Seven Kingdoms, enormous feasts, the formal display of Lannister wealth that Tywin used on such occasions to communicate the family's standing to anyone who might have recently forgotten it. Aerys attended as king, which meant that the occasion was organised around his presence, that the toasts were drunk in his honour, that whatever Tywin had intended as a celebration of his house became, in the way of all events where a king is present, also a celebration of the king. The accounts suggest that Aerys was charming that evening, that he spoke well of his hand and of the Lannister family, that the court was pleased and the mood was warm. What those accounts do not preserve, because it was not the sort of thing that ended up in formal records, was what Tywin thought during that evening as he watched his king receive the hospitality he had organised and the admiration he had assembled. Tywin was not a man who left extensive records of his interior life. He communicated in actions and in the careful management of his public face, and neither of those things told you what he was actually experiencing at any given moment. But the relationship between the two men in this period had a specific quality that those who observed it closely described in terms that suggest something more complicated than simple partnership. There was an asymmetry at its core that was inherent to the positions they occupied, king and hand, but that was also personal, rooted in the specific ways their personalities related to power and to each other. Aerys needed Tywin. This was not a secret, not even to Aerys, though it was probably a need he experienced as an irritation rather than a gratitude. A king who requires someone else to make his kingdom function is a king whose power is partly notional, and Aerys was perceptive enough about his own limitations, in this early period, before the imprisonment narrowed and distorted his perceptions, to understand that the reputation his reign was accumulating was substantially built on Tywin's work rather than his own. The admiration that the court expressed for the health of the Seven Kingdoms under this reign was admiration for the machinery Tywin had built and maintained. Aerys received the credit for it. This is how kingship works, or can work, when the arrangement is honest and the king accepts it honestly. Tywin, for his part, appears to have experienced the arrangement with a complexity that resists simple summary. He was genuinely gifted at administration in a way that went beyond ambition or calculation. The competence was real, and the satisfaction of competence exercised at the highest level is its own reward, distinct from and perhaps more durable than the rewards of status or wealth. But Tywin was also a man of enormous pride, the kind of pride that is not primarily personal vanity, but something more structural, a conviction that what he had built and what he was capable of deserved a certain quality of recognition, that the relationship between his contribution and his king's acknowledgement of it should bear some reasonable proportion to each other. As the reign went on, that proportion became increasingly difficult to maintain. Aerys's resentment of his own need for Tywin expressed itself in small ways at first. The joke at court that cut a little too precisely, the decision made without consultation that signalled Tywin's opinion was not required, the appointment that served no purpose except to remind the hand who ultimately held the authority between them. These were all within the ordinary range of what a king might do to manage a hand whose competence gave him more actual power than the formal hierarchy assigned him. They were not, in isolation, remarkable. Their significance lay in their accumulation and in their direction, which was consistently toward diminishment rather than toward any recognizable goal of policy. The court watched this dynamic with the specific attention that courts devote to relationships that determine the distribution of power. Everyone in the Red Keep understood that the relationship between king and hand was the relationship from which all other relationships derived their shape, and that any change in its nature would produce changes throughout the hierarchy beneath it. The lords who had cultivated relationships with Tywin were alert to shifts in his standing. The lords who had been disadvantaged by Tywin's decisions were alert to the same shifts, but from the opposite side of hope. The small council sat at the centre of this web of observation, and manoeuvred within it with varying degrees of skill, all of them aware that the ground beneath the court was not as stable as the formal ceremonies of daily governance made it appear. And beyond the court, in the great castles of the Seven Kingdoms, the lords who owed their primary loyalty to their regions, rather than to any particular faction in the capital, were making their own assessments of what they were seeing. The strength of the crown, in the system the Seven Kingdoms had developed over 3 centuries, was substantially a function of the credibility of the person who wore it, their consistency, their predictability, their demonstrated capacity to enforce the law and maintain the peace. Aerys, in his early years, had enough of these qualities to maintain confidence, but confidence, in politics as in other things, is more easily lost than earned, and the process of its loss had already, in these golden early years, quietly begun. There are moments in a life, not many but they exist, when something closes that does not open again. Not a door in the dramatic sense, not a single audible click of a latch, but a slow and permanent settling, like ice forming on still water, first barely visible, then present, then inescapable. Let your body settle now into the surface beneath you. Let the temperature of the room find you and hold you. The story arriving in this part of the night is a darker one, and it moves more slowly than the ones before it, which is fitting, because what it describes is the movement not of armies or of kingdoms, but of a single human mind losing its footing on solid ground and finding it cannot recover. The defiance of Duskendale, the year that broke Aerys Targaryen, and, through him, everything that came after. Duskendale was a port town on Blackwater Bay, a place of modest size and sufficient prosperity, known for its fishing and its trade, and the particular blue dye its craftsmen had been producing for generations. In the context of the Seven Kingdoms, it was not a significant place. It had no great history, no legendary founding, no dragons or ancient kings or battles that filled the pages of Maester Chronicles. It had a lord, a man named Daenys Targaryen, whose ambition substantially exceeded what his position entitled him to, and a wife, a Myrish woman named Sarala, whose counsel pushed those ambitions in directions they would not otherwise have travelled. The grievance was trade. Targaryen wanted a royal charter granting Duskendale special terms on its goods, a not uncommon request, the kind of petition that lords presented to their kings with some regularity, and that kings or their hands dealt with as administrative matters, denying them, or partially granting them, or deferring them into the comfortable obscurity of the small council's backlogged ledgers. Aerys, characteristically, had been resisting this particular petition for reasons that combined legitimate policy judgment with the increasingly erratic personal pique that was beginning to characterize his interactions with lords who persisted in asking for things he did not want to give. What happened next is the kind of thing that seems, in retrospect, almost surreally disproportionate. Daenys Targaryen, presumably advised by his Myrish wife that more aggressive action was warranted, invited the king to visit Duskendale personally to discuss the matter. Aerys, against the counsel of Tywin Lannister, who strongly and repeatedly advised against the visit, agreed to go. He arrived at Duskendale and was promptly imprisoned. His escort was killed. His herald was killed. He was taken into Darklin's Keep and held there, in conditions that the surviving accounts describe with a careful vagueness that nonetheless conveys something of the fear and the darkness and the particular helplessness of a man who is accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room, finding himself, without warning, entirely powerless. For approximately half a year, the records are not precise, but the estimates converge on roughly 6 months, Aerys Targaryen was a prisoner in a tower in an unremarkable port town while the Seven Kingdoms held their breath. Tywin, furious and calculating outside the walls, threatened siege and assault. The Darklings threatened to kill the king if any military action was taken. The standoff had the particular suspended quality of a crisis with no clean resolution, each move containing within it the potential for immediate catastrophe. What happened inside that tower during those months is not known with any confidence. The king who emerged was notably different from the king who had entered, but the transformation had no witnesses willing or able to describe it in detail. It was Sir Barristan Selmy who broke the impasse, the same Barristan who would eventually grow old in the service of the Kingsguard and become one of its most admired members. He was young then, barely past his training years, a knight of extraordinary personal courage, and he slipped into Duskendale alone, found where the king was being held, and managed to extract him before the Darklings could respond. The rescue succeeded. The king was freed, and Tywin Lannister, the restraint finally lifted, besieged Duskendale and put the Darkling family to the sword, with a thoroughness that left the town without a noble house to speak of. But the rescue, necessary and remarkable as it was, could not undo the 6 months. It could only end them. And what the 6 months had done to Aerys was something that no rescue could reach, because it had happened in the interior of him, in those private recesses of experience where captivity does its most lasting work. He emerged from Duskendale thinner. He emerged suspicious in a way that was qualitatively different from the suspicion he had shown before. More diffuse, less targeted, the suspicion not of a man who believes specific enemies are working against him, but of a man who has concluded that the world itself is hostile and that safety is an illusion that he will not permit himself again. He emerged with a relationship to fire that those who knew him before the imprisonment found altered in ways they struggled to articulate but could not deny. It is worth sitting with what imprisonment does to a person, very quietly for a moment. It does not do the same thing to everyone. Some emerge from it with their essential selves intact, perhaps quieter, perhaps more careful, but recognizably continuous with who they were before. Others emerge having been reorganized at some level that lies beneath conscious memory, beneath what they can observe about themselves. The experience of powerlessness, particularly for someone whose entire existence has been organized around the premise of his own supreme authority, carries a specific kind of damage. It introduces a doubt that cannot be argued away, because it is not an intellectual doubt but a bodily one. The knowledge, now resident somewhere in the flesh, that everything could be taken in an instant and held for months and returned but never fully restored. The Aerys who returned to King's Landing was still, technically, the same man. He had the same face, the same silver hair, the same violet eyes that had charmed the court in the years of his early reign. He sat on the same throne, held the same titles, was addressed by the same ceremonies. But the men who worked close to him in the years immediately following the imprisonment began to notice that he would not allow anyone to stand behind him. He would not permit his hair or his nails to be cut, so that both grew to uncomfortable lengths, the nails curving and yellowing, the hair tangling and matting. He began to suspect Tywin, his hand, his oldest companion, the man who had governed the realm in his absence and who had, through Barristan Selmy's mission, secured his freedom. He began to suspect this man of having arranged the imprisonment himself, or at least of not having tried hard enough to prevent it. And this is where the present darkness reaches back toward the future, because the suspicion of Tywin is not simply a detail of palace intrigue. It is the rupture that will eventually produce the conditions for Robert's rebellion. Tywin, a man whose pride was possibly the most precisely calibrated instrument in the Seven Kingdoms, a man who had given his talents and his years and his considerable organizational genius to the service of this king, found himself increasingly sidelined, increasingly suspected, increasingly the object of the public contempt that Aerys, now less careful with his cruelties, chose to display at court. The two men who had run the realm between them, whose complementary gifts had made something genuinely functional out of the Targaryen monarchy's late years, were separating, moving away from each other in the slow and inexorable way of tectonic things, and the ground between them was already beginning, though no one yet could feel it, to crack. The city of Duskendale in the year of the imprisonment would have been, to a traveller arriving from King's Landing, a place of unmistakable provincial quality, prosperous by the measures that matter to port towns, with the smell of salt and fish, and the tarred rope of the harbour mixed with the more ordinary smells of a market town going about its business, but without the scale or the complexity of the capital. The people who lived there knew its rhythms in the intimate way that people know places they have never seriously contemplated leaving. The merchants knew which ships came in on which tides. The fishermen knew the particular shoals and their seasonal behaviours. The craftsmen who produced the blue dye that had made Duskendale modestly famous in the markets of the region knew the proportions and the timing of the process in the way that craft knowledge lives. In the body, in the hands, passed between generations without always finding its way into language. Lord Daenys Targaryen inhabited this town as a man who was not quite satisfied with inhabiting it. The Darklings were an old family with a long association with their seat, but long association and deep satisfaction are not the same thing, and Daenys appears to have been a man whose sense of his own worth ran somewhat ahead of what the world around him was prepared to confirm. The Myrish wife, Serala, whom the people of Duskendale called the Lace Serpent, and who seems to have been considerably more strategically minded than her husband, had arrived in Westeros with a foreigner's eye for what native inhabitants often cannot see, the gaps between what the formal hierarchy promised and what it actually delivered, the places where ambition might find purchase if applied with sufficient boldness. The plan, if it can be dignified with that name, was almost touchingly miscalculated. The assumption appears to have been that holding the king would force concessions, the charter, the trading rights, the elevation in status that Daenys believed his family deserved and had been denied. That assumption required Tywin Lannister to respond to the holding of the king by negotiating rather than by laying siege, which in turn required a misreading of Tywin's character so fundamental that it suggests the Darklings had access to no reliable intelligence about the man who was effectively running the Seven Kingdoms. Tywin did not negotiate from positions of weakness. He did not negotiate at all, in the sense of offering something valuable to obtain something desired, unless the calculation of consequence left him no better option. A king held in a tower was not a situation that left him that option. What the 6 months did to Aerys, in specifics, the records do not fully capture because the records of those months are mostly the records of the siege, the movements of troops, the communications between Tywin and his subordinates, the occasional report from someone with access to the town about conditions within the walls. What happened in the tower where the king was held is reconstructed from Aerys's behaviour after the fact, from the changes that were noted by people who had known him before and encountered him after. The physical changes were visible and immediate. The refusal to cut his hair or nails, the weight loss, the specific quality of alertness that replaced the easier manner of his early reign. Not the alertness of engagement, but the alertness of a man who has learned not to let anyone approach from behind. The psychological changes were more gradual in their full expression, but traceable in retrospect to the same source. The paranoia that developed after Duskendale was not new in kind. The tendencies had been present before, observable by those who looked carefully. But it was new in degree and in its relationship to specific triggers. Before Duskendale, Aerys had suspected individuals who had given him specific reasons for suspicion. After Duskendale, he suspected categories. Anyone who stood behind him, anyone who touched him without explicit permission, anyone who counselled patience when he wanted action, anyone whose competence reminded him of his own limitations, anyone whose loyalty he could not verify through the specific tests his damaged mind had designed for the purpose. The legal consequences for the Darklings were complete and without exception. Tywin, once the king was freed, did not leave the matter to the ordinary processes of attainder and trial. He put the town to the sword in the comprehensive way of a man who intended the example to be unmistakable. The Darkling family ceased to exist as a noble house. Serala of Mere was tortured and executed. The details are in the records and they are not comfortable, and they say something about Tywin Lannister that the story of his administrative competence does not fully capture. The lesson the Seven Kingdoms drew from Duskendale was therefore double, that the king could be captured, which was a kind of vulnerability the realm had perhaps not fully contemplated before, and that the consequences of capturing him would be absolute. The night is deep now. Let it be deep. There is no urgency in the dark, no appointment it requires you to keep. What there is, in this particular night, is the slow accumulation of a history that most people have never had the time to examine carefully. The history of a court in the years after Duskendale, the history of what a damaged man does with the apparatus of absolute power when the interior checks that might have restrained him have been, through imprisonment and fear and the specific alchemy of prolonged terror, substantially dismantled. Let your breathing be easy. What we are moving through now is not a comfortable history, but it is an important one, and it has the particular value of explaining, across the distance of time, how catastrophes are built from the inside. The Red Keep, in the years following the Defiance of Duskendale, underwent a transformation that was noticed by everyone within it, and described differently by almost all of them, depending on what they had access to and what they were permitted to observe. The court continued to function in its formal dimensions. The small council still met. The lords of the realm still made their required appearances. The King's Guard still stood their posts in the gleaming white armour that was meant to signal the king's safety and the realm's security. But the texture of life within the keep, the specific quality of attention that people brought to their interactions with the king, the way that a casual remark could silence a room, the growing awareness that certain subjects must not be raised under any circumstances, all of this shifted in the years after Duskendale in ways that could not be precisely described but could not be ignored. Aerys had always had a cruel streak. This is documented in the earlier years of his reign before the imprisonment, in incidents that were noted and then, as such incidents tend to be, diplomatically forgotten. There was a Lord of the Reach who had spoken disparagingly of one of the king's projects, and found himself subjected to a public humiliation so precise and so prolonged that the man had wept openly in the throne room before the entire court. There had been punishments administered to servants for errors that most lords would have handled with a fine or a dismissal. The early cruelty was real, but it was, in the words of one maester who served in that period, calibrated, directed at specific targets, following something that resembled a logic even if that logic was often more petty than just. After Duskendale, the calibration was gone. What replaced it was something more ambient and less predictable, which made it considerably more frightening to those who lived within its orbit. Aerys distrusted in all directions now. He distrusted his lords, whom he had always viewed with some suspicion, but who now struck him as a network of potential betrayers, each one possibly in correspondence with his enemies, possibly arranged against him in patterns he could not yet fully perceive but could feel. He distrusted his servants. He distrusted his wife, whose relationship with him had always been difficult and now grew actively cold, the two of them occupying the same enormous castle in an isolation that was mutual and miserable. He distrusted Tywin Lannister, whose administrative genius he still occasionally required, and whose company he increasingly used, not for the warmth of old companionship, but for the satisfaction of a slowly escalating series of public diminishments. The history of the late reign is full of these diminishments, and they are worth understanding because they illuminate the nature of the specific damage Aerys was doing to the political fabric around him. At a great tournament at Harrenhal, the largest and most elaborate tournament seen in the Seven Kingdoms in a generation, organised and funded by a lord named Went, but widely understood to have been arranged at Tywin Lannister's instigation. Aerys arrived without being invited, effectively inserting himself into an occasion that was not his, and proceeded to behave in ways that managed to insult nearly everyone of consequence present. He made Tywin's son Jaime a member of the King's Guard, an honour that also effectively removed Jaime from the Lannister succession, and thus deprived Tywin of his heir, which everyone understood to be intentional. Tywin Lannister, who had spent the better part of 2 decades building the Lannister name into something that could survive contact with the throne's needs, who had administered an entire kingdom's finances and diplomacy and military affairs with a precision that the small council was entirely incapable of replicating without him, who had humbled the most powerful houses in Westeros when they had tested the crown's authority, this man finally resigned. He went home to Casterly Rock and watched from a distance while the court he had effectively run for most of the reign began its final phase of dissolution. Without Tywin as his hand, Aerys cycled through a succession of replacements whose defining quality was their malleability. He did not want a competent hand. He wanted a hand who would agree with him, who would not challenge him, who would not look at him with the particular expression that Tywin had developed in the last years of their association. That measured, unsurprised expression that contained within it a silent audit of everything the king was doing wrong. The men who served as hand in the final years of the reign, administered very little and agreed a great deal, and the machinery of government that Tywin had tuned to such precision gradually lost its alignment. The lords of the realm, watching this from their castles and their seats, began to make their own adjustments. The great houses of Westeros had learned, over the 3 centuries since Aegon's conquest, how to exist in the gravitational field of the Iron Throne, how close to orbit, how carefully to time their petitions, when to display loyalty most visibly, and when to quietly arrange their affairs in ways that did not require the king's notice. They had developed, across generations, a collective expertise in managing Targaryen temperament. But what Aerys was becoming in these years was something qualitatively different from the difficult kings they had dealt with before, and the traditional tools for managing a difficult king, flattery, patience, strategic absence, the gift that arrived at exactly the right moment, were not quite equal to whatever this was. If you are still awake, let yourself drift now. The history is not going anywhere. It will be here when your eyes close and here when they open, patient as stone, as patient as the records kept in the citadel that hold these stories in their careful archival silence. The great houses are beginning to move slowly the way of great houses, not in the direct way of men who have decided something, but in the oblique way of institutions making their preliminary arrangements, keeping their options open, watching the king and watching each other and performing loyalty with decreasing confidence that the performance was protecting them from anything. If this history is pulling you towards sleep, let it. The stories will keep. Subscribe if tonight's journey has been worth the keeping, so that the next night's history will be waiting when you return. And rest. The realm is not yet burning. That is still coming. But the wood has been laid, and the kindling is placed, and somewhere in the lower levels of the Red Keep, in the dark and slightly damp chambers that the pyromancers have made their own, men who have spent their lives studying a substance called Wildfire are spending increasing amounts of time in the company of their increasingly fire-obsessed king. The pyromancers were not, in the years immediately following Duskendale, the central feature of Aerys's changed behaviour. They came later. What was central in the first years of the post-Duskendale court was something harder to name, and therefore harder for those within it to respond to: the king's presence. Not his commands, not his policies, but the specific quality of being in the room with him. He had developed, in the imprisonment, a sensitivity to the atmosphere around him that expressed itself in ways that were difficult to distinguish from intuition. He could tell, or believed he could tell, when someone in his presence was not fully aligned with his interests. He read silences as communications. He read particular combinations of posture and expression as coded messages about loyalty or its absence. He was frequently wrong, but the wrongness was not falsifiable to him, because anyone who attempted to falsify it by denying the interpretation was immediately suspicious for the act of denial. This produced, in the court around him, a behavioural phenomenon that those who study institutions under authoritarian pressure recognise: the systematic retreat from honesty. The people who worked closest to the king, the council members, the servants of the Red Keep, the lords who had reason to attend court regularly, developed a shared style of communication that prioritised the avoidance of the king's negative attention over the actual communication of useful information. They agreed when agreement was possible, deflected when it was not, and reserved the truth for conversations conducted out of the king's hearing with the specific care of people who know that walls have ears and that ears have consequences. The King's Guard, whose function was to protect the king's physical person and whose institutional culture had developed over generations to emphasise absolute loyalty and absolute discretion, found itself in a position of particular difficulty. The White Cloaks had always involved an element of complicity in the private behaviour of the kings they served. The culture of the Order understood that what happened in the private chambers was not what appeared in the chronicles, and that the men who wore the white had seen things that could not be spoken of outside the Order. But the complicity being asked of them in the later years of Aerys's reign was of a different quality. Not the discreet overlooking of private vices, but the active participation in a regime that was becoming, by any standard the more thoughtful members of the Order might have applied, harmful to the people it was supposed to protect. The great lords of the realm, watching from their castles, were aware of all of this in the way that people at a distance from a fire are aware of its heat. Not in the immediate, overwhelming way of those in the smoke, but steadily, increasingly, with a growing sense that the comfortable distance between them and the situation was not guaranteed to remain comfortable. The system of governance they participated in had no mechanism for managing what they were observing. The laws of the Seven Kingdoms provided clearly for the consequences of treason against the crown. They did not provide because no one who designed them had found a way to write such provisions without undermining the absolutism that the whole system depended on, for the consequences of a crown that turned treasonous against its own people. Casterly Rock rises from the cliffs of the western coast like something that was not so much built as revealed, as though the stone of the promontory always contained the castle within it, and the Lannisters merely removed what surrounded it over the centuries. The rock beneath it is riddled with tunnels and chambers carved during the ancient occupation of the Casterly family, before a man named Lann the Clever took it from them through methods that the stories describe as cunning, and the Lannisters have preferred not to inquire too closely into. It is cold inside the deeper chambers even in the warmest months, and the sound of the sea comes through the stone in a low continuous presence, not quite sound, but something that the body registers in its own register. Imagine it tonight if you like. The cold chambers, the stone walls, the sea's murmur arriving through solid rock. It is a good place for quiet thought. Tywin Lannister had a great deal of quiet thought to conduct in the years after he left King's Landing. Tywin had built his career, and the Lannister name, and his own considerable sense of himself, on the premise that competence deserved power, and that power, once earned through competence, could be maintained through the continued application of the same. His father, Tytos, had been a gentle and rather ineffective lord who had allowed the other lords of the Westerlands to disrespect him and his family, borrowing gold they did not repay, treating Lannister authority as negotiable, laughing at Tytos in the corridors of his own castle. Tywin had corrected this in the most decisive manner available to him, through a military campaign against the most egregious offenders, through a systematic rebuilding of the family's reputation for consequence, through the cultivation of a personal manner so consistently cold and controlled that no one who dealt with him could comfortably imagine finding him amused by their disrespect. He had applied this same approach to his service as Hand of the King. The Seven Kingdoms in Tywin's administration understood what the kingdom's law was, understood what the consequences of flouting it were, understood that the Hand was not a figure to be managed or manoeuvred around. He had prosecuted the realm's military needs with brisk efficiency. He had kept the crown's finances in a condition that allowed for genuine policy, rather than the constant improvisation that characterized administrations without money. He had built alliances through marriages and through the simple reputation of doing what he said he would do, which is rarer in governance than it should be, and more valuable than most people account for. And then Aerys had systematically dismantled the relationship. Not all at once. That was not how Aerys operated. He operated through accumulation, through the slow addition of small humiliations and larger insults, and the occasional sudden cruelty, like a man adding weight to one side of a scale in amounts too small to feel, but in a direction that never reversed. Tywin had endured the public mockery. He had endured the implication, made more and more openly in the final years, that it was Tywin rather than Aerys who was the real power behind the throne, and that this arrangement was somehow an embarrassment to the king. He had endured the growing intrusions into his administrative authority, the decisions made without his counsel, the lords who came to him with problems that had already been complicated by the king's private interventions. The appointment of Jaime to the Kingsguard was the thing that finally severed it. Not because losing an heir was in itself an unrecoverable blow to a house as wealthy and established as the Lannisters, there were other children, but because the appointment made explicit what Tywin had been absorbing for years, that Aerys did not value him, had possibly never valued him, had used him as the tool a mediocre king uses a capable hand, and had simultaneously resented the evidence of the capability. It was an act of contempt dressed as an honour, and everyone at the tournament at Harrenhal understood exactly what it was, and Tywin understood that they understood, and this was perhaps the most precise wound of all. He went home to Casterly Rock and did not come back. He sent the courtesies that a great lord owed his king, the letters, the attendance at events where absence would be conspicuous, the acknowledgement of royal commands that did not require his personal presence to implement. But the intimacy was over. The man who'd been Aerys's oldest friend, closest advisor, most capable administrator, was now simply a very powerful lord who happened to be seated at the far end of the realm, watching the court from a distance and drawing his own conclusions about what he was seeing. What he was seeing from that distance was deterioration. The small council, without Tywin's organising intelligence, had reverted to the usual condition of such bodies, a collection of men with divergent interests and limited vision, managing immediate problems rather than administering long-term policy, spending more energy navigating the king's volatility than on the actual work of governance. The treasury, which Tywin had kept in reasonable order, began showing the strain of Aerys's increasingly expensive obsessions. The pyromancers, who had always had a small foothold in the Red Keep, were now a significant presence, receiving royal patronage and protection that insulated them from the skepticism they would otherwise have faced from a more grounded administration. The lords of the realm read this distance between Aerys and Tywin carefully. The Lannisters were the wealthiest house in Westeros, possessed of the gold mines at Casterly Rock, whose output still set the standard for the realm's coinage. They were militarily formidable, politically experienced, and served by the most sophisticated intelligence network in the West. When such a house withdrew from the court, quietly and without drama but unmistakably, the other houses noticed. They did not immediately conclude that rebellion was coming. That conclusion required additional evidence that had not yet fully assembled itself, but they adjusted their assessments of the regime's stability, the way that careful people always adjust their assessments when the most capable administrators decide they have better things to do with their time. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet of the night, to consider what a different history looked like from this same point. Had Aerys managed the relationship with Tywin differently? Had he found, somewhere in the wreckage of his post-Duskendale self, the capacity to keep the one man who could hold the kingdom together? The events that followed might not have followed in the same way. This is speculation, and speculation is never fully satisfying, because it always reaches the same limit. The thing that happened is the thing that determined everything that came after, and the things that did not happen lead only into the fog of possibility. But it is a useful speculation. It reminds us that the great catastrophes of history are rarely the result of single causes. They are the result of accumulated choices made by people who were trying, in their various ways, to manage situations they perhaps did not fully understand. Tywin Lannister sat in Casterly Rock and waited. He did not advertise what he was waiting for. He did not, in the way of men who know what is coming, begin obvious preparations. He simply sat and administered his own vast holdings with the competence he had always brought to administration, and received the reports his agent sent him from the capital, and kept his own counsel in the cold chambers of the rock, while the sea pressed its endless murmur through the walls around him. He was not a man given to patience as a virtue, but he understood it as a tool. And the thing he was waiting for, though he could not have predicted its precise shape, was approaching. What Tywin did with his time at Casterly Rock, in the years of his withdrawal from the court, was not nothing. It was not the conspicuous idleness of a man making a political point through his visible disengagement. He administered the Westerlands with the same methodical attention he had brought to the administration of the Seven Kingdoms, kept the roads maintained, kept the courts functioning, kept the accounting precise, maintained the network of relationships with the lesser lords of the West that formed the foundation of Lannister authority in the region. He was, by all accounts, an effective lord of his own domain, in a way that the Seven Kingdoms as a whole had benefited from, when that domain was the entire realm. He also, in these years, made marriage arrangements for his children that reflected his understanding of where the political situation was heading. Cersei's betrothal to Rhaegar Targaryen had been a possibility he had pursued, and that Aerys had dismissed with the specific contempt he reserved for anything that would increase Lannister influence near the throne. Tywin had absorbed this dismissal, as he absorbed most of the king's insults, without visible expression, and had proceeded to position his children in the ways that remained available to him. The political marriages he could arrange were arranged with the care of a man who was building something, though the precise shape of what he was building remained for the moment unspecified. The lords who visited Casterly Rock during these years, and there was a steady if not ostentatious flow of such visits, found Tywin in a posture of careful normality. He spoke of the king with the correct formulations of loyalty. He expressed no criticism of the regime that could be quoted, or that would have been useful to anyone who wanted to bring it to Aerys's attention. He was the picture of a great lord who had stepped back from the centre of power for reasons of personal dignity, and was now occupying himself appropriately with the administration of his own considerable holdings. The picture was accurate as far as it went. What it did not show was the long arithmetic Tywin was conducting in the private chambers of his mind, the calculation of assets and liabilities and timing that would eventually resolve into a course of action. Wildfire is difficult to describe to someone who has never seen it. The maesters of the Citadel, whose default mode is the systematic reduction of the wondrous to the comprehensible, tend to describe it in the language of chemistry, a substance produced through the alchemical arts, combining materials and processes whose details the pyromancers guard more carefully than almost anything else they possess. But the descriptions of those who have encountered it in use, in the fragmentary accounts from battles and from incidents of accidental ignition, tend to be less categorical, more intimate. They speak of the colour first, not the orange and yellow of ordinary fire, but something in the green spectrum, a jade-coloured flame that burns so hotly that even water does not suppress it, that clings to whatever it touches and continues burning through submersion, through suffocation, through most of the ordinary methods by which fire is managed. They speak of the sound it makes, which is not quite the sound of ordinary fire. They speak of the smell. And they speak, more than anything else, of the sensation of encountering something that does not behave as combustion is supposed to behave. Something that seems to have its own logic, its own will almost, its own opinion about what it wants to burn. The alchemists, the pyromancers as they preferred to be called, had existed on the margins of the Targaryen court since the early years of the dynasty. They claimed descent from older practitioners, from Valyrian traditions of fireworking that predated the Doom, though the claim was largely unverifiable, and the masters viewed it with the specific skepticism they reserved for anyone claiming to have preserved meaningful fragments of Valyrian knowledge. What was more concretely true was that they had managed over centuries to perfect and standardize the production of wildfire to a degree that made it militarily useful. Slow, expensive, difficult to store safely, and profoundly dangerous to the people producing it as well as to those it was intended for, but demonstrably effective in the right circumstances at the right scale. Dragons had made the pyromancers largely ceremonial for most of the dynasty's history. When the Targaryens had their dragons, the pyromancers' arts were a curiosity, a supplement to a weapon of such overwhelming power that supplements were rarely needed. But the dragons were gone now, had been gone for more than a century, and in their absence the pyromancers occupied a peculiar position in the Red Keep, present, theoretically useful, producing their substance in small quantities in their underground chambers, maintained by royal patronage that had varied in its warmth over the reigns but never quite extinguished. Under Aerys, the warmth became something considerably more than patronage. It became fascination. It became, in the years after Duskendale, something that those who watched it develop struggled to name precisely. Not quite devotion, and not quite obsession, but partaking of qualities of both. Aerys spent time with the pyromancers that he did not spend with his council, his lords, his family, or the administrative business of the kingdom. He asked to observe the production process, then to observe it repeatedly, then to participate in it in a supervisory capacity that the pyromancers found flattering and somewhat unnerving in equal measure. He began commissioning production on a scale that the pyromancers had not previously been asked to achieve, requiring them to expand their operations, increase their output, address the dangerous question of storage for quantities of wildfire that were much larger than anything they had previously attempted to keep. What was he doing with it? This is a question that the lords and maesters of his court asked in various ways and in various degrees of directness, and the answers they received were never fully satisfying. The king spoke of defence, of the need to protect King's Landing from threats that his mind had populated, with a specificity and urgency that those around him found disproportionate to the actual military situation. He spoke of the enemies that surrounded him, not merely foreign enemies, though foreign enemies featured, but domestic ones, lords whose loyalty he could not trust, a hand he had disposed of but whose ghost still occupied a significant amount of his mental attention, a succession of perceived slights and conspiracies that had been accumulating since before Duskendale and had never stopped accumulating. But there was something else in the relationship with Wildfire that went beyond the tactical. The accounts of those who were present in the pyromancer's chambers with him, the accounts that survived into the records and were honestly set down rather than diplomatically vague, suggest that Aerys was not simply commissioning a weapon. He was seeking an experience. In the presence of Wildfire, of the green flame and the heat and the particular aesthetic quality of something that burned with such intensity that ordinary material definitions seemed to stop applying, he found something that functioned for him the way that the old Targaryen dragons had presumably functioned for his ancestors, a direct, unmediated encounter with power in its most elemental form. The form that needed no allies, required no loyalty, was not capable of betrayal. The dragons had carried a particular meaning in the Targaryen imagination that was not purely military. They were, in the mythology of the family, the source of its identity, the thing that made Targaryens different from other men, the expression of the old Valyrian blood in its most magnificent form. Their death had been a diminishment, and every Targaryen who came after had understood this diminishment, without being able to do anything about it. Aerys, who had become in his damaged state increasingly disconnected from ordinary human relationships, who no longer trusted the people around him, who had lost the capacity for the kind of collaborative existence that makes political power function, Aerys was reaching toward the closest equivalent available to him. He wanted to be the thing his ancestors had been, the man who commanded fire rather than merely ruled men. He began, in the final years of his reign, to speak of it in ways that unsettled even the pyromancers who had benefited most from his patronage. He spoke of transforming himself. He spoke of fire as a form of purification, of the city's enemies burning, of a final cleansing that would settle all the accounts that had accumulated during the long years of his paranoia. He added to the underground chambers of the Red Keep and to locations throughout King's Landing, whose placement followed a logic that was his alone, quantities of wildfire that the pyromancers had produced for him over years of expanded operation, caches distributed through the city in a pattern that would not be fully understood until much later, when someone finally sat down with the maps and the records and realized what had been there all along. It is worth sitting with that image very quietly. The city above, going about the business of its ordinary life, the markets and the brothels and the sept and the harbour, and the 1,000 small exchanges that constitute the daily functioning of a great capital, and below it, distributed through its foundations and its drains and the spaces in its walls, quantities of a substance that burned with green fire and could not be extinguished by water. The king who put it there believed, at some level that had moved beyond rational argument, that this was a reasonable thing to do. He was afraid. He was alone in a way that his position had always made impossible to admit. He had lost, piece by piece, every relationship that had once provided him something resembling stability, and he was sitting, in the depths of his damaged mind, on top of a city that he had been quietly preparing, for years, to burn. Let your breathing remain easy. This is history, and history has already happened, and it cannot reach you here in the dark and the quiet of tonight. But it is important history, because the choices made in those underground chambers, the wildfire distributed through the city like a secret held in the walls themselves, shaped everything that followed, shaped the rebellion that was coming, and the sack that ended the reign, and the kingdom that emerged from the ashes. Some secrets outlast the people who kept them. Some arrangements made in fear and madness sit in the foundations of the present, patient as stone, waiting for someone to discover what is there. The pyromancers operated in chambers below the Red Keep that had been adapted for their particular needs over a period of generations. The original spaces had been storage vaults, the kind that any great castle accumulated in the process of housing large numbers of people across centuries. Deep, cool, stone-walled, accessible by stairways that wound through the keep's foundations in ways that the original builders had not fully documented. The pyromancers had extended and modified these spaces as their operations grew, adding ventilation shafts and drainage systems and the specific arrangements of stone and metal that their production process required, until the underground complex they occupied was something the casual visitor to the Red Keep would not have suspected existed from the castle's visible surface. The substance they produced there was, from a practical production standpoint, an exercise in managing instability. The precursors were not individually dangerous. Several of them were materials used in other trades, in dyeing and in preserved food preparation, and in the kind of chemistry that healers practiced. The danger emerged in the combining, in the specific sequences and proportions that the pyromancers had worked out across generations of trial and terrible error. Their records, the ones that survived, the ones that were not themselves destroyed in the accidents that periodically reshaped their underground workspace, described a process requiring 4 people, working in specific positions performing specific functions in a specific order, with timing regulated by marks on candles rather than by judgment, because judgment under pressure was not reliable, and the consequences of errors in judgment were not recoverable. Aerys's presence in these chambers disrupted the ordinary rhythms of the work in ways that the pyromancers found difficult to address. The king had questions. He wanted to understand not merely the end product but the process, the sequence of additions, the changes in colour and consistency at each stage, the specific point at which the substance crossed the threshold into something that could not be handled without the special containers the pyromancers used for transport and storage. He wanted to be present for that moment. He wanted to see the colour shift. The pyromancers, who understood the risks of what they were producing in the visceral way of people who have worked around it for years and lost colleagues to its unpredictability, were not comfortable with a king leaning over a production vat at the moment when the mixture was most likely to ignite spontaneously. But kings are not comfortable to refuse. The pyromancers managed Aerys's presence in the chambers the way that those without power managed the demands of those with it, by giving him what he wanted at its safest, by staging demonstrations that satisfied his desire to witness the substance in action without exposing him or themselves to the most dangerous moments of the production process, by providing the experience of proximity to fire without the full reality of what proximity to wildfire at scale actually meant. They were, in their way, performing for him, and he was, in his way, performing for himself, enacting the role of the fire commander, the dragon lord without a dragon, in the underground chambers of a castle in a city that was, by his command, increasingly honeycombed with the substance that could burn it from within. The quantities involved, as they were eventually reconstructed by those who discovered the caches after the sack, were genuinely staggering. Not the quantities of a military stockpile, not weapons prepared for a specific tactical use in a specific battle that could be planned for. The quantities were those of a long-term commitment, of someone who had been adding to the supply, not in response to a particular threat, but as a permanent feature of the city's infrastructure, the way that a city adds to its water storage or its grain stores as a matter of ongoing maintenance. The wildfire was in the walls. It was in the drains. It was in chambers that the maps described as old storage that no one had occasion to inspect. It was, in the most precise sense of the term, everywhere, distributed through the body of the city the way a poison, administered gradually, distributes itself through the body of a living thing. There is a kind of terror in the slow realization of what this means, and it is a terror that those who discovered the caches felt acutely. The city had been, for the years of this preparation, living on top of a catastrophe that only the king's continued survival had prevented from becoming actual. Every morning that King's Landing woke to its ordinary business, every market that opened, and every ship that unloaded, and every bell that rang from the Great Sept, had been happening in a city that was simultaneously a city and a tremendous quantity of waiting fire. The people in it had not known this. They had gone about their lives in the ordinary confidence that the ground under their feet was ground, that the walls around them were walls, that the city was what it appeared to be rather than what it secretly was. There is a question that no one who thinks carefully about this history can avoid, though most people who encounter the story of Robert's rebellion focus on the war itself, rather than on the question that precedes it. At what moment did the rebellion become inevitable? Not merely likely, not merely foreseeable by the careful observers who had been watching the regime's deterioration from a cautious distance. Inevitable. The word that describes the point at which the forces in motion have accumulated sufficient momentum that no individual decision, no act of reconciliation, no sudden recovery of whatever had been lost could have arrested them. There is no precise answer. But there is a reasonable case to be made that the moment occurred, not on a battlefield, but at a tourney, at the same great tournament at Harrenhal where Tywin had been so publicly diminished, where a mystery knight called the Knight of the Laughing Tree had won several bouts and vanished before being unmasked, where a young man from the north had crowned a young woman as Queen of Love and Beauty with a crown of winter roses. Let your mind settle into the night. This is a story that moves slowly at first, and then very quickly, the way that the long stillness before a storm gives way to everything at once. Lyanna Stark was the daughter of Rickard Stark, Lord of Winterfell. She was, by the accounts that survive, a young woman of considerable spirit and physical courage, characteristics that the men around her tended to describe in ways that reduced them, calling her willful or wild or unwilling to accept the constraints her station required of her. She had been promised in marriage to Robert Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, a match that would have made political sense by the standards of the era. Robert was said to love her. genuinely, by his own account, as genuinely as a man of his appetites and enthusiasms could love a particular woman, rather than the idea of a woman he had decided to love. What Lyanna thought of the arrangement is not recorded with any useful precision, because the thoughts of young women about their arranged marriages were not, in that world, considered information worth preserving. At Harrenhal, a young prince named Rhaegar Targaryen, the eldest son of Aerys, a man of genuine intellectual distinction and musical gifts, and a somewhat melancholy personal quality that the histories tend to romanticize, and that was probably rather more complicated in its lived reality, crowned Lyanna Stark with winter roses at the end of the tourney rather than his own wife, who was present, who could observe the gesture and who understood what it meant to the assembled court, even if its precise private meaning was known only to Rhaegar. The act was read throughout Westeros as a public statement of romantic intention, and romantic intention directed at someone else's betrothed carried specific and serious implications in the politics of honour that governed the great houses' relationships with one another. What happened next is one of the most contested questions in the history of the Seven Kingdoms, and it is contested not because the facts are entirely unknown, but because the interpretation of those facts carries enormous consequences for how several of the realm's most significant figures are understood and judged. Rhaegar and Lyanna disappeared together. Whether she went willingly, whether she was taken by force, whether she had reasons of her own that are simply not preserved in the records, these questions have never been resolved with certainty. What is certain is that she disappeared, and that her disappearance, combined with the death of her father Rickard and her brother Brandon at the hands of Aerys, produced the conditions for war. Brandon Stark, Lyanna's eldest brother, had ridden to King's Landing to demand justice for his sister. He had not been diplomatic about it. He had been young and angry, and Stark, which in the north means a specific combination of directness and indifference to the political delicacy that the capital required of its visitors. Aerys had imprisoned him, and summoned his father Rickard to answer for the boy's apparent threat against the crown prince. Rickard had come, as a lord was required to come when summoned by his king, and both men had been executed in a fashion so deliberately theatrical in its cruelty that it served as its own kind of announcement, an announcement that this king was operating outside the ordinary constraints of Westerosi law and custom, that the protection a lord was due when he answered a royal summons no longer applied. The manner of the deaths was what was broadcast through the realm as much as the fact of them. Rickard Stark was suspended in his armour over a fire and effectively cooked alive while Aerys demanded that his son, held nearby, call for justice, not from the king but from the flames themselves. Brandon, attempting to reach his father, strangled himself in trying to break his restraints. The scene was designed not as justice but as theatre, as a statement of the king's power over life and death that was so far outside the recognised limits of royal authority that it could not be rationalised as an excess of punishment. It was something different in kind from excess. It was the behaviour of a man who had concluded that the ordinary rules no longer applied to him because he was afraid of them. Eddard Stark, Ned, as most people knew him, the second son, the quiet one, the one who had been fostered in the Vale and who had not been present for any of what happened to his family, inherited Winterfell and the war simultaneously. Jon Arryn, his foster father, had refused the king's demand to send Ned and Robert Baratheon's heads to King's Landing as the heads of traitors, and this refusal was effectively the formal beginning of the conflict. Lisa Tully's father Hoster threw the Riverlands in with the rebellion. The Arryns brought the Vale. Stannis held Storm's End for his brother, and across the Seven Kingdoms, lords who had been watching the regime's deterioration with increasing unease found in Rickard Stark's death the specific outrage that crystallised years of ambient disquiet into something they could call a cause. Robert Baratheon was the rebellion's hammer. He was a young man of enormous physical presence and genuine military talent, a fighter in the mode that Westeros valued most obviously, direct, devastating, capable of inspiring the kind of personal loyalty that men offer to leaders they have seen stand in the front rank and take what the enemy delivers. He was not, at this point in his life, the dissolute king he would eventually become. He was a lord of genuine charisma fighting what he understood as a war for his betrothed and for the honour of his allies, and he was very good at it. The trident was the pivot, the great battle on the river where Robert killed Rhaegar Targaryen in personal combat, ending not only the Crown Prince's life, but the last realistic possibility that the Targaryen dynasty could survive what was coming. If you feel yourself drifting now, let yourself go. The rebellion is not over yet. The capital remains, and the sack is coming. But this is a long history, and it has been moving for a long time, and the body, listening to it, earns its rest. If these histories are worth the keeping, subscribe so that the next night's story waits for you. The channel continues to grow through the loyalty of those who find that these long, unhurried journeys through the past serve the purpose that they serve. The quiet accumulation of understanding, the slow replacement of the day's urgency with something more like perspective. The war lasted roughly a year. That is a remarkably short time, in the context of the history we have been moving through. A year against the decades of deterioration that preceded it. A year against the generations of Targaryen rule that preceded that. A year against the 12,000 years of Westerosi history that preceded the Targaryens entirely. But it was a year of sufficient violence and sufficient consequence that it rewrote the political map of the Seven Kingdoms in ways that are still, in the story's present, being felt. Aerys, in the Red Keep watching the war go wrong, retreated further into the logic of the Wildfire. If the rebels came, he had decided they would find a city already prepared for them. He had 300 years of Targaryen dynasty to protect, and if he could not protect it through the ordinary methods of kings, he would protect it in the only way that remained to him. The War of the Usurper, as the Targaryen loyalists named it, and Robert's Rebellion, as the victors preferred, had the particular temporal quality of events that seem, during their occurrence, to be moving very slowly, but that in retrospect compress almost to instantaneity. Those who fought in it, who survived to give accounts of their experience, tend to describe the individual battles as individual battles always are described. The specific terror and confusion of the close engagement, the exhaustion between engagements, the bad food and the worse water and the rain that seem to accompany every significant movement of troops through the riverlands. They do not describe it as quick. They do not describe it as clearly organized. They describe it as the lived experience of war always is, chaotic, intermittent, uncertain as to outcome at most moments, and fully comprehensible in its shape only from the outside and after the fact. The battle at the Bells, the fighting around Stony Sept, where Robert Baratheon had been cornered by a loyalist force and was discovered and released by the rebel army that fought through the town to reach him, is the battle that the songs prefer, because it has the right narrative qualities: the concealed hero, the desperate search, the town rising to hide him, the rescue. Songs require compression and clarity, and the Bells offered both. What the songs do not capture, because songs are not obligated to capture it, is the human cost of the fighting through those streets, the specificity of what happened to the buildings and to the people in them when a military engagement moved through an inhabited town. The aftermath of each major engagement was a period of what the military histories call consolidation, and what the people in the affected areas experienced as something considerably more difficult. The Riverlands, which bore the brunt of much of the fighting by virtue of their geography and their political position as the territory through which both sides needed to move, sustained damage that would take years to repair. Harvests disrupted, livestock taken, villages that had been on the margins of economic viability pushed below it by the combined pressure of military requisitioning and the general collapse of the trading relationships that sustained them. The war lasted a year. The recovery took considerably longer, and for some people in some places did not arrive within their lifetimes. Rhaegar Targaryen, killed at the Trident, had been the hope of the Loyalist cause in a way that his father was no longer capable of being. The records of the Loyalists who survived the war, those who eventually bent the knee to Robert or who fled to Essos and wrote from exile, describe Rhaegar in terms that have the quality of posthumous idealization, which is the quality that almost always attaches to princes who die before they can disappoint the expectations their gifts raised. He was brilliant, they say. He was thoughtful, unusually so for a man trained primarily as a soldier. He had read more than any prince of his era had reason to read, had studied history and prophecy and music with a seriousness that suggested a genuine engagement with ideas rather than the performance of cultivated interests. He had been, in the view of many who had known him, a possible solution to the problem his father had become. A prince capable of displacing a mad king and ruling in his stead if the means of that displacement could be found within the law. The means had not been found in time. Rhaegar's death at the Trident ended the conversation about what he might have done, and the story moved on to what Robert did instead, which was to be crowned, and to try to build a kingdom from the materials that his rebellion had left him, and to discover that the building was considerably harder than the fighting, and that he was less well equipped for it. King's Landing in the final days of the Targaryen dynasty was a city in the peculiar condition of suspended consequence, a place that knew something terrible was approaching but could not yet feel the full weight of what that meant, the way that the air before a storm carries both the smell of water and a strange stillness that is less absence of wind than presence of held breath. The small folk of the city, the several 100,000 ordinary people who did not sit on councils or command armies or make decisions about the fate of kingdoms, went about the diminished business of siege conditions, the shortened markets, the careful rationing, the steady low-grade anxiety of people who are not in control of what is happening to them, and who have learned, through long experience of not being in control, to manage that anxiety by keeping the hands busy. The city had survived much. It was reasonable to believe it would survive this. Aerys had sent his queen and his remaining son, a very young child named Viserys, west on a ship before the siege closed fully around the city. This was the act of a man who, whatever else had become of him, retained some capacity for the protection of his bloodline's continuation. Rhaella and Viserys would reach Dragonstone, where the queen would die in childbirth in the middle of the storm that the same night produced a daughter named Daenerys. But that is a different story's beginning. In King's Landing, in the final weeks, Aerys was receiving news of the rebel army's approach and issuing instructions to the pyromancers that made his intentions clear to the men who understood what those instructions meant. He wanted to burn it. The full scope of this plan, as it was reconstructed afterward by people trying to understand what had nearly happened, was approximately as follows. When the rebels entered the city, the wildfire caches distributed through King's Landing's foundations would be ignited. The city would burn with a fire that could not be extinguished by ordinary means. The hundreds of thousands of people within its walls would die. The rebels would die. The lords who had betrayed him would die. And Aerys himself would be, here is where the accounts diverge on his precise expectation, either translated by the fire into something beyond ordinary death, something like the transformation he had spoken of to the pyromancers in the last years of his reign, or simply satisfied that the thing he had built and ruled and feared losing was not going to be ruled by anyone else. The logic, if it can be called that, was the logic of a man who had lost the capacity to imagine a future he could live in. Tywin Lannister arrived first. This is the fact that most people who know the broad outline of the story know, and it is a fact whose significance tends to be somewhat misread. Tywin did not arrive with his army because he had decided to join the rebellion, or not exactly that, and not at that moment in any publicly declarable way. He arrived at King's Landing presenting himself as a loyalist, as a lord of the Seven Kingdoms coming to relieve the siege of his king's capital. The gates were opened, the Lannister army entered King's Landing and proceeded to sack it. The word sack carries a meaning in military history that is both precise and insufficient. It describes a specific thing, the systematized violence that follows the capture of a fortified position, in which an attacking force, released from the formal discipline of the assault phase, engages in killing and looting that is understood by the military conventions of the era as the acceptable consequence of a city's failure to surrender. It describes something real and something terrible, but it describes it from a distance that the people inside the city experience as much more intimate than the word suggests. The Lannister sack of King's Landing killed people. It destroyed things. It introduced into the city a violence that had not been there in the long stillness before, however anxious that stillness had been. In the throne room of the Red Keep, Aerys had retreated to the Iron Throne itself, the physical object that Aegon the Conqueror had built from the swords of his enemies, a throne so elaborately uncomfortable that the maesters believed it was a deliberate design choice, a reminder that the act of ruling required the endurance of discomfort. Aerys, surrounded by his remaining pyromancers, had given the final order. The wildfire was to be ignited, the city was to burn. And if the accounts are accurate, he was repeating the words that had become his primary speech in the final weeks, burn them all, with the insistence of a man reciting something that had become, over years of slow psychological erosion, less a command than a prayer. Jaime Lannister was the member of the Kingsguard present in the throne room, the same Jaime whose appointment to the Kingsguard Aerys had used to wound Tywin, the same Jaime who was Tywin's son, and who had been, since his appointment, in the peculiar position of owing his primary loyalty not to his family, but to the king who had taken him precisely to deny him to that family. Jaime was 18 years old. He killed the pyromancer who had received the command to ignite the wildfire. He killed the others, and then he killed Aerys Targaryen, the man he had sworn to protect, by driving a sword into his back while the king was attempting to reach a torch with which to ignite the conflagration himself. The throne room was quiet afterward, by all accounts. Jaime sat down on the steps of the Iron Throne, not on the throne itself, which would have been a statement he had no interest in making, and waited, with Aerys's blood cooling on the stone around him, for whoever was going to arrive next to find him there. What he was thinking during that wait is something he has described in different ways at different moments over the years, never quite arriving at a version that satisfies the people who ask him about it, possibly because no version of it satisfies him entirely. He had killed the king he had sworn to protect. He had saved an unknown number of people, hundreds of thousands, by the estimates of what the wildfire might have done, in a way that would be permanently unacknowledged, because the wildfire plan was never known outside the small circle of those involved, and Jaime had no way to prove what he had prevented. Ned Stark arrived shortly after with the van of the rebel army. He found Jaime on the steps of the Iron Throne and Aerys dead on the floor, and he drew the conclusions that the scene permitted, that a member of the Kingsguard had killed the king he was sworn to protect, which was in every definition available the act called kingslaying, and which carried a moral weight in the culture of the realm that could not be easily mitigated. Ned and Jaime had a complicated and cold relationship for the rest of Ned's life, rooted in this scene and in Ned's absolute inability to understand it fully from the outside, and his absolute commitment to judging it from within the only framework he knew. Robert arrived and made the throne his own. The Targaryen dynasty ended with Aerys's blood on the throne room floor, and his only surviving legitimate child, Viserys, too young to understand what had happened, on a ship crossing the narrow sea. The war was over. The new king was crowned, and in the city that had almost burned, in the streets that were still processing the shock of the sack, life began its slow resumption, the way life always resumes after the thing it was afraid of either happens or doesn't, and the people who remain move carefully back into the space where ordinary time used to be. The specific manner of Aerys's death has been described in several ways by the people who had access to what Jaime Lannister said about it, in the moments when Jaime could be induced to say anything about it at all. The sword went in from behind. This is almost certainly true in the literal physical sense, and it carries an obvious resonance given Aerys's obsessive requirement in the final years of his reign that no one stand behind him. There is something in this that resists the tendency to read it as symbolically tidy, because it was not tidy. It was a young man of 18 making a decision in a matter of seconds, in a throne room full of the evidence of what was about to happen, with the specific urgency of someone who understood the mechanism of wildfire, and understood what the command to ignite it meant, and understood that he had the means to prevent it, and that the window for preventing it was approximately the width of a moment. Jaime has never been fully forgiven for the act, in the sense that the word Kingslayer, which attached to him in the immediate aftermath and has never fully detached, is not a word of forgiveness. The cultures of the Seven Kingdoms have a complicated relationship with the concept of necessary transgression, with the idea that there are moments when the right action is also the formally wrong one, that the system of oaths and obligations that makes civilization possible can, in extreme cases, produce requirements that conflict with the more fundamental obligation to prevent mass harm. The faith of the Seven has its own formulations for this problem. The Maesters of the Citadel have engaged with it philosophically. The practice of governance in Westeros has encountered it repeatedly, in various forms, over the centuries of the dynasty's existence. But the encounter with it in the throne room of the Red Keep in the last hours of the Targaryen dynasty was not philosophical. It was immediate and physical, and left a body on the floor and a young man sitting in the blood with his sword in his hand waiting for whoever was going to arrive and determine what his situation meant. The irresolvability of the situation, the impossibility of proving what had been prevented, the certainty of the accusation that would attach to what had been done, seems to have settled into Jaime in the years after as something he carried rather than something he resolved. He did not defend himself to Ned Stark except in the minimal and insufficient way of a man who says that the king had ordered something and he had stopped it, which provides the skeleton of the truth without the flesh that would make it comprehensible. Ned Stark stood in the throne room and looked at what was there and drew the conclusions available to him, and those conclusions, accurate in their facts and incomplete in their understanding, shaped his relationship to Jaime Lannister for the rest of his life. Ned was a man of specific and unbending moral architecture, whose value came precisely from its consistency, and whose limitation was the same consistency applied to situations where the architecture's load-bearing assumptions did not hold. He could not see what Jaime had prevented because he was looking at what Jaime had done, and what Jaime had done was exactly what the word on everyone's lips said it was, and Ned did not have a category for the thing that lay underneath the word. The broader sack of the city produced injuries and deaths and damage to property that were, in aggregate, significant. They were not, however, catastrophic in the way that Wildfire would have been catastrophic, and this is the comparison that has to be held in the mind even as the sack itself is accounted for. The Lannisters' arrival had not been gentle. The people of King's Landing knew in the days and weeks after that the city had been sacked, and the word sack carried meaning that was experiential and immediate to those who had lived through it. They did not know, and would not know for years, that they had also been within hours of something that would have made the sack seem, by comparison, like a manageable historical incident. The relief that should in principle have accompanied this knowledge was not available to them because the knowledge was not available to them. History frequently withholds this particular mercy. The awareness that things could have been worse is not always granted to the people for whom the worst thing did not quite arrive. The night has come a long way with us now, and there is something worth observing about the particular quality of this hour. The hour past midnight, past the second wind that keeps people awake when they should be sleeping, past the point where the mind's ordinary resistance to rest gives way to something more accommodating. This is the hour when thoughts grow longer and more associative, when the distance between distinct things collapses and connections become visible that the waking mind would compartmentalize. It is a good hour for the kind of thinking we are moving toward now, the thinking that traces lines of consequence forward through time, that asks not merely what happened, but what the happening made, what it distributed into the people who came after, what it planted in bloodlines and in institutions, and in the specific psychological textures of those who inherited both the genes and the damage. Aerys had 3 children who survived him. Rhaegar, the eldest, died at the Trident before his father, and so did not inherit the throne he had been trained for. Viserys, the second son, was evacuated to Dragonstone and eventually to the Free Cities, where he grew up in exile in poverty by the standards of his expectations, increasingly defined by the particular damage that dispossession and thwarted entitlement work on a mind that begins with certain tendencies. Daenerys was born in the storm at Dragonstone, never knew her father, grew up across the narrow sea in the shadow of her older brother's increasingly unstable personality, and emerged into adulthood carrying a complicated inheritance she spent much of her early life trying to understand. None of Aerys' direct descendants are wholly free of him. This is not a mystical claim. It is a psychological and environmental one, grounded in the ordinary mechanisms by which a parent's damage propagates through the lives of those closest to them, whether through direct exposure, through the environment they create, or through the characteristics they pass on through blood. Viserys was the most obviously scarred. He had been 3 years old when King's Landing fell, old enough to know that something terrible had happened and that the world he was supposed to inherit had been taken from him, not old enough to understand any of the complexity that surrounded that loss. He grew up with his mother's stories, partial, grief-stricken, constructed to make sense of a catastrophe from the inside, and with a sense of absolute entitlement to a throne that existed only in those stories, in the increasingly threadbare performance of royal dignity that he and his mother, and then he alone, maintained in the guest rooms of Pentoshi magisters and the hospitality of increasingly impatient hosts. What Aerys gave Viserys, directly and indirectly, was the coin's worst face. The same bloodline instability, the same tendency under pressure toward paranoia and cruelty, was expressed in Viserys in a form that was partly inherited, and partly the product of a life that had provided very little in the way of the counterweights that might have steadied it. Where Aerys had been a king who went mad, Viserys was a pretender who went mad, which is somewhat different in texture and entirely equivalent in damage. He was capable of genuine feeling. There are moments in the records of his exile years when something recognizably human shows through the accumulated bitterness, but the feeling was always contained within a framework of entitlement that could not be questioned without producing a reaction disproportionate to the challenge. Daenerys absorbed the inheritance differently, partly because she experienced it differently. She had no memory of Aerys. She had an older brother whose increasing instability she navigated with the specific adaptive intelligence of someone who has grown up alongside something unpredictable and learned to read it. She had the stories of dragons, of the dynasty's greatness, of the throne that was supposed to be hers, but she had also, in her early years with the Dothraki and later in the Free Cities, experience of a world that did not organize itself around those stories and that had its own claims on her attention and loyalty. She was, in some ways, the most Targaryen of Aerys' surviving descendants in appearance, and in certain qualities of the personality, the particular combination of genuine compassion and sudden, absolute decision-making that brooks no opposition, and also the most genuinely original, the one most shaped by the world she actually inhabited rather than the world she had been told she deserved. But the inheritance shows in her too in ways that the story makes visible. The question that hangs over her narrative in the later books in the series, the question that those who love her hope will resolve one way, and those who fear her fear will resolve another, is precisely the question about the coin, which face is showing, and how stable is the showing. She has the capacity for the greatness that the best Targaryens demonstrated, the genuine revolutionary impulse, the willingness to burn down corrupt structures rather than accommodate them, the personal bravery that does not ask for reassurance. She also has the Targaryen relationship with fire that is not merely tactical but existential, and a relationship with absolute authority that has been shaped by the specific context in which she learned to exercise it, which is not a context that offered much in the way of limitation or consequence. The children who were not her own direct descendants, but who were Aerys' grandchildren through his son Jaime and his daughter Cersei, present the inheritance in yet another form. Joffrey Baratheon, or Joffrey Lannister if we are being genetically precise, was in some ways the most disturbing reflection of Aerys in the generation that followed. He had the cruelty without the complexity of the context that had produced the cruelty. Aerys had become what he became through a sequence of experiences that, however inadequate as excuses, at least provided a narrative. The imprisonment, the fear, the paranoia that grew from genuine trauma. Joffrey came to it younger, and without any particular precipitating catastrophe, which suggests something in the bloodline that was not exclusively the product of experience. Cersei's relationship to her father's legacy is subtler and perhaps more interesting in its way. She's not mad in the clinical sense that Aerys was mad, and the history that produced her choices is legible in ways that Aerys' late history sometimes is not. But she shares with him a certain absolutism of feeling, the inability to absorb insult without a response, the equation of any challenge to her authority with an existential threat, the love for her children that functions simultaneously as genuine devotion and as an extension of her own narcissism, so that threats to the children become threats to herself, and responses to those threats carry a personal quality that pure parental protectiveness would not always produce. She is not Aerys. She is something that Aerys' blood, filtered through Tywin's and through her own particular life made, something that shares certain root characteristics while expressing them in an entirely distinct key. It is worth sitting very quietly with what this means in the accumulated darkness of the late night. The things that Aerys did, the damage he inflicted and received, the choices he made in the cell in Duskendale and the chambers with the pyromancers and the throne room in the final hour, none of these ended with him. They moved forward. They distributed themselves into the people around him, and then into the people around those people, the way that a stone dropped in still water produces rings that reach the shore long after the stone has settled to the bottom. The worst kings do not merely damage the realm during their reign. They damage the people who survive them, who carry the damage into the next generation and the generation after that. Jon Snow, who is, by blood if not by knowledge, Aerys' grandson through Rhaegar and Lyanna, carries the inheritance in a form so thoroughly filtered through Ned Stark's raising that the Targaryen components are not immediately visible in him. He has the personal courage, and something of the melancholy, and perhaps something of the capacity for a connection to fire that runs deeper than the merely pyrotechnic. But he has been shaped, above all, by the North, and by the values Ned Stark spent his life embodying, and those values are in almost every particular the opposite of what the late Aerys represented. He is the answer the blood gave to itself when given the right soil, a possibility that the coin might have produced and that the history, after great violence, somehow managed to produce anyway. That is something. It does not undo what came before, but it is something. The question of what constitutes inheritance is more complicated than the word initially suggests. In the ordinary uses of the term, the inheritance of property, of title, of the formal obligations that attach to a house's name, the mechanisms are clear enough. A person dies, and what they held passes to whoever the law and custom of the place determine is next in line. But the inheritance that Aerys distributed through the people around him and through the people who came after those people operated through mechanisms that were not so clearly delineated, and that the people receiving the inheritance were often not aware they were receiving. Cersei Lannister's relationship to her father's legacy, to both her father's legacies, given that she was shaped at least as much by Tywin as by Aerys, is one of the more psychologically intricate threads in the later part of the story. She grew up in a household that defined itself through the explicit rejection of everything Aerys represented. Tywin's court at Casterly Rock was orderly, competent, emotionally controlled, organised around the very qualities whose absence in Aerys had driven Tywin from the capital. The implicit lesson of Cersei's childhood was that kings who could not manage their own houses were kings who lost their thrones, and that the discipline of the self was the foundation of all other power. And yet what Cersei developed, inside the structure of that lesson, was not quite the thing the lesson was supposed to produce. She absorbed the conviction that power was the organising principle of relationships, and that those without it were exposed to those who held it in ways that could not be entirely mitigated by good behaviour or genuine virtue. This conviction was not false. It was, in its way, an accurate reading of the world she'd grown up in and the world she inhabited. But the conclusion she drew from it, which was that power had to be protected at any cost from any challenge regardless of the challenge's legitimacy, moved her toward decisions that had a recognisable relationship to the decisions that had undone Aerys. The equation of challenge with threat, of honesty with betrayal, of any constraint on her authority with an attack on her person. The Targaryen blood in her children, the blood that made Joffrey what Joffrey was something Cersei understood intellectually, but could not fully account for emotionally, because accounting for it would have required a kind of self-examination that her particular armour of pride made difficult. She loved Joffrey with the absolute commitment she brought to everything she defined as hers, and the things she defined as hers she defended with a totality that did not naturally include the possibility that what she was defending might be damaged in ways that her defence was making worse. Daenerys' inheritance from Aerys is the most philosophically interesting precisely because she is the most aware of it. She has been told in exile in the stories of her brother and her mother's attendants, and eventually in the accounts of those who had served under the Mad King, something of what her father was. She has processed this awareness in the way that people process the knowledge of a terrible ancestor, with a mixture of repudiation and residual identification that is not quite resolvable into either. She is not him. She is also, in certain particular moments of decision, demonstrably his daughter. The challenge of her story is the challenge of the coin, whether the awareness of the risk is itself a sufficient counterweight to the tendency, or whether there are pressures sufficient to tip even an aware person toward the catastrophe they have spent their life trying to avoid. Jon Snow, growing up as Ned Stark's bastard son, inherited a great deal from the man who raised him, and almost nothing that was visibly Targaryen. He absorbed the northern ethic, the conviction that honour was not a performance but a practice, that the right action did not become less right because it was costly, that the oath you swore was binding in ways that the oaths you did not swear were not. He became a version of the Targaryen blood's possibilities that was almost entirely mediated by the specific moral tradition he was raised in, and this mediation produced something that the unmediated version of that blood had never quite managed to produce across the 3 centuries of the dynasty, a person who used authority primarily as a tool for the benefit of those subject to it, rather than as proof of his own exceptional nature. The Iron Throne is an uncomfortable object. This is not an incidental detail. It was built, according to the histories, from the swords of the enemies and allies who submitted to Aegon the Conqueror during his campaign of unification, melted together by Balerion the Black Dread over 9 days of sustained dragonfire. The result is less a chair than a statement, a mass of twisted black iron decorated with protruding blade edges that have, over the centuries, cut every king who sat too carelessly in it, some of them with enough severity to require the maester's attention. The folklore of the realm holds that the Iron Throne cuts those who are unworthy to sit it, that Aegon designed it as a test as much as a seat. The maesters of the Citadel tend to explain it as simple, metallurgical impracticality, the natural result of fusing 1,000 swords without sufficient attention to the experience of the person who would have to occupy the result. Both explanations contain something true, and both leave something out. Let your breathing be slow. The night is at its deepest point now, and what remains of this history is not an accounting but a reflection, the long look backward that makes sense of everything that came before. Robert Baratheon sat on that throne for 17 years, and the throne cut him in its own way. Not literally. Robert was a physical man who would have dismissed the blade nicks that more careful kings agonized over, but in the sense that the governance of the Seven Kingdoms was a task that he had been built, by temperament and by training, to win through combat and to find unsatisfying in the long peace that follows. He was a conqueror who had nothing left to conquer, and a man of appetite who had all his appetites systematically satisfied, and found that satisfaction produced not contentment, but a specific kind of restlessness. He drank. He hunted. He maintained the court's external functions well enough that the realm did not collapse immediately, but the machinery of government was run, as it had been under the last Aerys, by other people. In this case, primarily by the hand, first Jon Arryn, and then Eddard Stark. The specific damage that Aerys inflicted on the institution of the throne, the damage that Robert inherited and that all subsequent kings would inhabit, is not simply the damage of a bad predecessor. It is structural. What Aerys did, in the years of his reign's deterioration, was demonstrate that the system of government the Seven Kingdoms had built around the Iron Throne could not self-correct. It had no mechanism for managing a king whose judgment had been compromised, no constitutional procedure for the removal of a sovereign who had lost the capacity to rule, no body with the authority to say that the person sitting on the throne was no longer fit for the position. The small council could advise, the hand could manage, the great lords could withhold their support and eventually resort to rebellion. But rebellion is a drastic correction that damages what it corrects, leaving a realm that has survived the bad king still bleeding from the surgery that removed him. Robert's regime inherited the bleeding. It inherited the specific political debts of the rebellion, the Lannisters who had sacked the capital, and whose support for the new king was as much a claim on future favour as an act of loyalty, the lords who had fought and whose houses expected acknowledgement of that service, the lords who had not fought and whose uncertain loyalties required management rather than trust. It inherited the symbolic deficit of a dynasty change mid-history, the absence of the kind of legitimacy that comes from deep continuity. They need to construct a narrative of the new order's rightness that would satisfy the people who had benefited from the old one and the people who had fought to end it. Ned Stark served as Robert's hand for less than a year before his death, and in that year he encountered the specific shape of the rot that Aerys had introduced into the institution. The throne was in debt, to the Lannisters most of all, to the Iron Bank of Braavos, to a financial situation whose dimensions were substantially worse than Ned had been led to understand before he accepted the position. The small council was a body organised around the interests of its members rather than the interests of the realm. The King's Master of Coin was a man named Peter Baelish, who had been systematically redirecting the Crown's finances in directions that served his own accumulation of power, and who had been doing so with a creativity that had impressed the Council into overlooking the fundamental corruption of it. The institutions that Tywin Lannister had once made functional were, in the absence of either Tywin's discipline or anything equivalent to it, doing what institutions without supervision tend to do, drifting toward the private interests of whoever controlled them. Joffrey sat on the throne for a brief and catastrophic tenure, and what he demonstrated was the worst-case version of what the institution had always risked: absolute power in the hands of someone who was simply not governed by the ordinary constraints of empathy or consequence that make power bearable to those subject to it. The beheading of Eddard Stark, a decision made without consultation, against the counsel of nearly everyone around him, in defiance of the basic political logic that would have preserved the peace, was the purest expression of what the throne, as Aerys had left it, could produce: a decision of absolute finality made by a person whose judgment could not be questioned by any mechanism the system possessed. Tommen, the child who followed Joffrey, had none of his brother's cruelty and was destroyed by that absence, ground down between the interests of the people around him, each of whom needed him to be something different, none of whom were adequately governed by the system that should have protected a young king from being used as a tool by those with the access and the will to do so. Aerys' legacy in Tommen is the legacy of a system that cannot produce wise governance from insufficient input, and that has no capacity to supplement what the occupant of the throne cannot provide. The realm gets the king it gets, and the institutions either hold or they don't, and in the absence of the kind of deep structural reform that no one in the story has either the power or the will to attempt, they mostly don't. And then there is Daenerys, arriving from across the sea with dragons that no one had expected, and claims that everyone had to suddenly recalibrate for, presenting the realm with the question that the long history of her father's reign had made inevitable. Can a Targaryen rule justly? And if so, what conditions produce that outcome? And how does the realm distinguish in advance between the coin's two faces? The question is real, and the story does not resolve it cleanly, which is probably its most honest quality. Aerys destroyed every future king after him not by leaving a bad precedent, though he did that, but by leaving a system that had been shown to be incapable of preventing the worst version of itself, and that still had not, as the story reaches its present complications, developed the capacity to do so. If you find yourself drifting now, let it happen. Let the history settle in the way that long things settle, not as conclusions but as the ground that makes the next thought possible. The records will keep, the histories will remain. Subscribe if tonight's journey has been worth returning to, so that the next night's history waits when this one ends. Sleep is the most underrated form of archival. The mind stores in the dark what the waking hours were too busy to properly file. What remains, in the deepest part of the night, is not the fire, and not the blood, and not the specific cruelties and catastrophes this history contains. What remains is something quieter, the image of a court in the early years of a reign, before the damage was done, when two men walked in a garden and the kingdom ran well between them. The image of a young queen standing in the narrow sea's cold wind, with two very small children and a world completely rearranged around her loss. The image of Barristan Selmy walking into a city alone to find a king and bring him home, performing an act of bravery that the king he saved could not ultimately use. These are the small images that outlast the large ones. They are the history beneath the history, the human material that the larger story is built from, the evidence that even in the worst chapters something recognizably tender was present. Sleep now, the watch is ended, the fire has gone cold, and the long darkness is, at last, simply the night doing its ordinary and generous work. If you like this journey tonight, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I am always curious about that. And if there is a corner of this history you would like to explore further, a figure or an era or a question the night did not fully answer, leave it in the comments. The histories are long and the nights are many, and there is always more to find in the dark. The succession of kings who followed Aerys onto the Iron Throne each encountered, in their own way, the specific deformation that his reign had introduced into the institution they were trying to occupy. The throne itself was unchanged, still iron, still sharp, still uncomfortable in the way that Aegon had apparently intended. But the meaning of sitting on it had been altered in ways that were not immediately obvious, and that revealed themselves only under pressure. Aerys had demonstrated that a king who had lost the confidence of the realm could not be removed by any mechanism that the realm possessed short of rebellion. And rebellion, as Robert's War had shown, was enormously costly even when it succeeded. It left behind it a kingdom that had survived but had not emerged intact. The debts were the most concrete expression of this. The Crown's finances, when Ned Stark arrived as Hand and asked for a true accounting, revealed a deficit so large and so long-standing that it could not be attributed to any single administration's mismanagement. It was the accumulated consequence of years during which the machinery of governance had been run primarily for the benefit of whoever was running it, with the long-term health of the institution treated as someone else's eventual problem. Aerys's reign had contributed to this. The pyromancers did not work for free. The court's increasing isolation from competent administration had allowed inefficiencies to compound. The war itself had consumed resources that had not been adequately replaced. Robert's administration had continued the pattern, because Robert was not interested in the details of governance, and had surrounded himself with people whose primary skill was in managing the appearance of good governance rather than its substance. The institutional damage was in some ways harder to quantify and more durable than the financial damage. The great houses had absorbed from the experience of the Aerys years and the rebellion that followed a set of lessons about the limits of the Crown's authority that could not be unlearned once learned. They had seen that a king could lose his mind and his kingdom could continue to function, mediated by his hand, and that the hand's authority was therefore not simply delegated, but in some circumstances primary. They had seen that the loyalty owed to the throne was not unconditional in practice, even when it was stated as unconditional in theory, and that the conditions under which it could be withdrawn were somewhat broader than the formal definitions of treason allowed. They had seen that winning a war against a reigning king was possible, which it had been possible before, but which the specific example of Robert's rebellion made vivid in a way that previous rebellions had not, because this one had succeeded so completely and had replaced the dynasty rather than merely replacing the person. There is a concept that the Maesters sometimes discuss in the context of political history, the legitimacy gap. It describes the distance between the formal authority a ruler claims and the actual authority that the governed are prepared to recognize. And it describes the ways in which this gap, when it becomes sufficiently wide, tends to be closed either through reform, through changes in the ruler's behavior that bring the formal and the actual back into alignment, or through rupture, through the forcible collapse of the formal structure under the pressure of the actual. Aerys, in the final decade of his reign, opened a legitimacy gap in the Targaryen dynasty so wide that it could not be closed by reform, because the person who would have had to do the reforming was not capable of it. The rupture that followed was the only closure available. Robert's dynasty inherited the gap in a different form. His own legitimacy was built not on Targaryen continuity, but on the right of conquest, and on the consent of the lords who had fought alongside him, and this is a different and somewhat thinner foundation than the foundation of 3 centuries of established dynasty. It could be maintained as long as the king maintained the support of the great houses, which required the great houses to believe that their interests were better served by the existing regime than by any alternative they could imagine. Robert managed this, with diminishing returns, until his death. What he did not manage was the transmission of the capacity for this management to his successors, because the successor who bore his name was not, in any meaningful sense, his. The long shadow of Aerys Targaryen falls across the story of the Seven Kingdoms in ways that are sometimes direct, in the children and grandchildren who carry his blood, in the wildfire that Tyrion Lannister used at the Blackwater, and that the discovery of the additional caches complicated considerably, and sometimes indirect in the structural weaknesses of the regime that his madness opened, and that none of the subsequent administrations quite managed to close. He is not simply a character in the story. He is a condition of the story's present, the unseen presence in the room of every political calculation, made by every significant figure in the narrative's main timeline. They are all, in various degrees and through various mediations, living in the world he made.